Today's episode, we are diving into the topic of surveillance in this country, as well as the history behind that and why we are possibly seeing it here now in this part of our nation's history. The fourth turning has been quite a big topic of discussion. And so Michael Wilkerson is here to talk to us about those historical perspectives and his inside knowledge on the surveillance that happens both from the money side and from things like, we're hearing that parents are on terrorist watch lists for showing up to school board meetings, pro-life voices are having the FBI show up at their doorstep, and so on and so forth. So we're going to tie all of these things together here with Michael Wilkerson. He is the author of the new book out, Why America Matters, The Case for New Exceptionalism. He also has a book out called Stormwall, Observations on America in Peril. And he's a frequent contributor to prominent media outlets on topics including economics, which is his background, economics and finance, governance, and foreign affairs. Michael holds an MBA from Harvard Business School and an MA in international relations from Yale University, and is a BS summa cum laude from Oral Roberts University. So we're going to tap into his expertise, and he's got quite the interesting background. So I want you guys to hear from Michael today here on Faithful Freedom.
Where do we go from here? Because the battle has just begun. As eyes open, we continue to arm ourselves with the truth in all aspects of our lives, asking questions and relentlessly searching for answers, educating ourselves and forging a new path forward. Hear from real people faithfully pursuing freedom. This is Faithful Freedom with Teryn Gregson, presented by We The Patriots USA, a nonprofit 501c3 organization working to preserve and reclaim our God-given inalienable rights.
Hi, Michael. Welcome to the podcast.
Hi, Teryn. Great to be with you today.
Thanks for coming on. If you don't mind giving a little bit more of a brief background into what you were doing prior to the pandemic, because I think it lends and you bring an insight to this topic of surveillance that I think is important due to your background.
Sure, happy to. So I spent most of my career in business and finance. I was on Wall Street for well over a decade as a mergers and acquisition advisor, doing cross-border transactions in Europe and elsewhere. I was also the CEO of a public company later that was investing in businesses in Africa, especially in food and energy security, financial services, and education. And so I've had a long experience in markets, in financial services, looking at the economy, looking at other issues, and really took a bit of a turn in 2020 when I started to write on and comment publicly around some of the things that were going on in our country, in the United States, seeing what was happening with the pandemic, with lockdown response, this rising conflict with China, social unrest within our own country. And it prompted me to start to address some of these issues, including from a financial and economic standpoint. So I started talking about inflation back in 2020, when people thought that was kind of a crazy idea, fringe, it would never happen here. And of course, now we're living it out. All of that, the further I went into it, the deeper I went into it, the more I realized that the problem was actually much bigger than I had imagined. And it led me to write this book that has just come out, Why America Matters, The Case for a New Exceptionalism, really to help Americans, myself included, as I was going through the research process, to understand more about what is happening in our country. And of course, most importantly, more than just pointing to the problem, being able to identify what can we do about it? How can we go forward from here? And so it was a big labor, but it was a labor of love, coming at it from that background, and yet talking about a lot of issues that are affecting Americans from all walks of life today.
Absolutely. And I think that it's key in there too, that you were doing a lot of work over in Africa, which we know that China has been infiltrating their economy and their culture over there for quite some time. And that obviously lends to the topic of surveillance that we're diving into a little bit. And I mentioned off the top of the show, the fourth turning, which is like the hot topic right now, talking about that and the cycles that we see throughout history. And people are saying that we're coming up on this next 80-year cycle, that we're coming up on the fourth turning here, which kind of lends to the history of the tyranny and the surveillance that our founding fathers had here in America. Kind of talk a little bit about how this isn't necessarily unprecedented times. It's just times that we haven't lived through.
Yeah, well, absolutely. So I think one of the things I talk about in Why America Matters is, of course, our current crisis, but also to say that no, this is not unprecedented. We've gone through very difficult times in the history of our nation, and yet somehow always managed to bounce back. Think about what was going on at the time of the founding. Yeah, the founders had revolted from the largest and most powerful empire in the world and had tried to set up something that didn't exist anywhere in the world, a new form of government based on ideas that had been talked about, written about, but not applied anywhere. And of course, that was a generational cataclysm. It was such a fundamental change. And then roughly 70, 80 years later, the nation goes through another terrible, wrenching experience in the Civil War, which of course was a long time coming. The issue of slavery was never settled in the States, and it really finally came to a head violently as the only way to resolve the difference between what the Declaration had said, the idea that all men were created equal, and the practical reality that it was not being put in place anywhere, at least in the southern part of our country. And then even through the 20th century, the Great Depression, the wars, and otherwise. So we've seen very difficult times before. We've seen times when our country has been split apart before. Again, going back to the decades before the Civil War, where we were terribly divided over the issue of slavery in this nation. And I think we're still living in the echoes of that. But today we see a similar sort of divisiveness between the country. You mentioned, how some of this, even the government is calling half of the country domestic terrorists. So it's a difficult time. And so I started to write about these issues, and you asked the question about surveillance. So let me come to that. So I talk about 4 types of crises that we're facing in our country. And one of them I described the crisis of institutions, which is this idea that our federal government has gotten so big and so out of control that it's taken on a life of its own and gone well beyond what the power that it should have. And one of the manifestations of that, is first of all, there's a great deal of incompetence, but also corruption and this abuse of power. And the way it manifests is in the surveillance state, is in this overweening abuse of power to surveil, not just foreign enemies, but the American people themselves. And this has a bit of a long history. So if you go back all the way to the 1960s, when we go forward, there was something done in the 1970s called the Church Committee, the Senate Committee. A senator from Idaho put together a committee to investigate what had been going on in the 60s and early 70s with the CIA and the FBI and their abuse of power and their surveillance of citizens. And there was all sorts of things that came out about, for example, tracking, surveilling, wiretapping Martin Luther King Jr., other civil rights leaders. It went all the way across the board. It turns out they were tracking Ernest Hemingway and others. All sorts of
Sounds
things.
familiar, right?
Yeah, it sounds very familiar, doesn't it? So this committee did hold those organizations accountable. There were some changes at the time, but here we are a generation later, as you just said, back in the same place where we're seeing over and over again the abuse of power by these government institutions, such that, as you commented earlier, even targeting parents who dare to say that they think they should have a role in their children's education and how they're instructed. So much so that the DOJ has to come out against them and have the FBI start looking into this. That's a terrible thing. And I think the one thing that I was encouraged by in that whole situation was that the parents did not back down. The parents kept going and did not cave in, but found courage that they didn't know that they had or didn't know that they would ever need for a situation like that. And it's resulting in real change in school boards, change in the governor of that state of Virginia, towards someone who believes in parental rights and ran on that platform. So as difficult as the situation is today, I do keep hope that with the courage and the resilience of Americans around this country, that there's hope for a brighter future than what we're seeing today.
And maybe the solution is in exactly what you were just saying of parents not backing down, people not backing down, because as you noted in the 60s and the 70s, when they launched into that investigation, what our lawmakers did surrounding that obviously didn't really take hold. And here we are seeing the same issues.
Absolutely. And it's, you go back to, I believe it was around 2010 or so, when all these revelations came out from Edward Snowden and others about this very thing, how effectively the government had, the NSA had a vacuuming of information, of telephone calls, emails, all sorts of any kind of transmissions, not against foreign adversaries, not against people in the country who shouldn't be here, who are doing nefarious things. It was so wide sweeping and such a dragnet that the courts ultimately did say, yes, this is illegal. You have to stop. Do I have any belief that it has stopped or just changed form and changed name? I don't think it has stopped. I think this stuff is still going on. And of course, we see it even most recently in the revelations of the Twitter files, what we're seeing coming out about government collusion with big tech across a number of agencies. We have one example in Twitter, but we know, or we strongly believe and have a lot of evidence that this is going on platform to platform to platform. So I think, we're living in this very dangerous age where the technology exists to have complete informational control. And if a technology exists, the government is going to try to use it unless there are constraints on that power, constraints on the abuse of that technology or that power. And that is the test and the trial that we are in today. And by the way, one of the things I talk about in the book, Why America Matters, is strangely, it's really no longer between what we used to call right and left. I comment that populist conservatives have more in common with old school liberals, people who used to believe in privacy and keeping government out of business, keeping out of wars, autonomy, independence, the right to be free from surveillance. Those two now are more aligned against the surveillance state and against people who are just perfectly happy to have government invade all aspects of our lives, not realizing that our freedoms are being stripped away one by one. And and appreciate personally that this can be very invasive. And once those freedoms are gone, they're very difficult to get back. So this is the struggle that we're engaged in on all sorts of fronts.
Absolutely. And that's something that we talk about a lot on this show, that it's not left versus right. It's very much, government versus the people, and how they're trying to take away those powers from all different angles and break down the people. And I also want you to comment on and go into how, the effects on what the government is doing to its own people, how we're sort of, this is self-inflicted, right, in a way, of what's been happening to us, how then that allows, foreign powers to prey on those vulnerabilities, and what we're potentially looking at with all of this.
Yeah, there's so much in what you just said, and I want to just try to parse it out a little bit. And I talk about in the book, Why America Matters, that we're facing both external adversaries and internal, or domestic forces that are actually working against us to undermine the fabric of the values and ideals of America. And so we've talked a little bit about the role of government and surveillance, and how we've come to this new phase of the abuse of that power through this overreaching bureaucracy. But there is another element domestically, which is we've been in a generational cycle of an indoctrination process of a very terrible ideology. It goes by a lot of different names, but its roots are in postmodernism. And the ideas behind postmodernism is there's no truth, there's no identifiable right or wrong. It's really whatever words mean only what you want them to mean, and you can twist them and turn them for your own purpose. The ideas of postmodernism are so cynical and so detached that it undermines the very ideas of truth. And most of us going about our lives didn't think about what was going on in the universities, this process of sort of re-education. But it has had the effect on all of us of making us question our own history, making us question the validity of even basic ideas of truth. We've seen, and I talk about in the book, the crisis of identity as another big issue, that more and more Americans are less and less sure of who they are, why America matters, what about their own history. And that confusion is worse and worse the younger you go in age cohort, where today younger generations really have no idea about the importance of their own history, their heritage as Americans, because in part they were never taught it. And if they were taught it, they were taught a lie about how it was bad and did this and that. So, of course, we absolutely have foreign adversaries who would like to see America weakened, who'd like to see our economy weakened, but would also like to see the fundamental principles and ideas of America weakened. Take, the views of the Chinese Communist Party that has no place and no desire to see the kind of democratic process that America represents, the kind of liberties, individual liberties that America represents, the fact that we still care about human rights and believe in a very basic idea of we the people, this idea that it's the people who are sovereign, not the political party in power. That's, of course, hostile and inimical to the ideals of the Chinese Communist Party and their own power structure. So we're seeing this collusion between the objectives of foreign powers, foreign adversaries, and the ideologies being taught in many of our schools, universities, and now a political party that's bought into it, where the radical left absolutely does not believe in the virtues and values of America. And you get these, again, younger generations, younger cohorts asking very fundamental questions like, why democracy? Maybe there's a better way to organize our government. Why capitalism? Maybe there's a better way to organize our economy. Not realizing that those others, whether it be socialism, communism, etc., Marxism as an ideology, have failed and failed horribly in the past century, with the loss of millions and millions of lives of men and women who suffered under these regimes, which stand in just day and night contrast with the founding ideas of America. If I can mention one thing, and I know I'm kind of going on here a bit, but if you
No, it's
look
very
at
interesting.
what foreign observers on America commented time and time again when they'd come in the mid-19th century to visit this nation was just how central religion was to the foundation of this nation. That it permeated life, it permeated community, society. Often we were described as one of the most religious people in the world. And that was absolutely foundational to the ideas of the nation. If you look at the basis of the principles that were laid out, this idea that we had God-given, unalienable rights that could not be taken away by any king, by any government, by any bureaucracy, because they weren't given from them. They were given by God to the people, that the people were sovereign. Number one. Number two, this idea of the separation of powers, so that no one branch of government could accumulate power to itself. No king, monarch could collect the power, not just between branches of government, but also between the federal government and the states. So there would be a check on the power of the federal government by the states. And then number three, the rule of law, this idea that no person was above the law. These are the kinds of things that made America great, was this idea that everybody was going to be accountable. But let me come back to the point that I was making on religion, which is that because it was so central, and by the way, almost to a man, the founders knew and commented, even if their own personal beliefs weren't as strong, or they were more deist or unsure or what have you, they all recognized the same thing, that religion was essential to this country, and that if we ever lost that foundation, that base, the center would not hold. And why is that? It's because, of course, the idea of God, the idea of religion, enables a society to have a true morality. Mm-hmm. And you need morality in order to have both truth and trust. And when you lose religion, you lose any basis of morality other than power itself, whatever the ruling party says, these are goods and these are bads. But you lose both the idea of truth, which we talked about in postmodernism, but also trust, that we no longer have a basis to trust one another. And that's the dangerous place that we're in right now. This crisis of institutions means that the government no longer trusts us, and we no longer trust them. But we also are starting to feel that way about our fellow citizens, and that's a dangerous place to be on all sorts of fronts.
Yeah, I think so many people feel like we're not even on the same sort of foundation whenever we come together and talk about these issues, that, people are so far apart before they even start to discuss these topics. Like you mentioned, when you have that foundation of religion, you have that foundation of truth, and you're basically arguing over what is is truth. And now we're arguing over if there even is truth. And that is just so confusing for people. How do you even have a conversation like that when you can't even agree that there is a foundation of truth?
Yeah, and you think about the process that's happened through the 20th century, this very intentional stripping away of any expression of religion or truth in our public schools, in our public institutions. When Thomas Jefferson wrote a letter to a friend talking about this concept of the separation of church and state, which has been twisted terribly in this century, the idea was Jefferson was saying it's essential that we keep the state out of the church. We're not going to have state-sponsored churches that are funded by the government, that are sponsored by the government, that tell you you can worship this way, you can't worship that way. That is the idea of the separation of church and state. Keep the government out of the churches. It was never intended to keep religion out of public life, out of morality. That was not what he meant. That was not what it intended. And again, it's only been in this century that it's been twisted and turned by our Supreme Court and elsewhere, and then echoed to say that that's what it meant. No, the American story, the American history was this integration of these beautiful ideas of truth and morality and how they would affect the community, how they'd affect our culture, our society. It is only because of faith, of religion, that in America in the first half of the 19th century, abolitionist societies sprung up all across the country. The largest one had over 100,000 members. It was from the churches. It was from women, especially leading the charge to say to their husbands and their brothers and their fathers, we have to end the slave trade. We have to end slavery in this nation. It's not a legal issue. It's a moral issue. It's foundational to the human dignity of these people, and for us to live up to the idea that all men are created equal. Without religion, without morality, that process never would have happened. It's not slavery that's an aberration in history. Slavery has been around for thousands and thousands of years. What was the aberration? And it sprung out of the Christian tradition, the Judeo-Christian tradition. This idea that there is neither slave nor free, that all men are equal, neither male nor female, that both are equal in the eyes of God. These kind of ideas, of course, require religion. Otherwise, it's just whatever you want to believe, whatever you think is true. This is what we're losing today as we see an increasing secularization in our society, and once again, especially among younger ages.
And that has also bled over into the private sector as well, and the way that so many of these companies run, and the the blurring of the lines between the government, the public, and the private sectors, and how that is also encroaching on the surveillance. Really, I mean, we feel like we're being surveyed through our jobs. Never before in history had we had to submit our vaccination status. Never did they have to know different medical statuses that we had as employees, and those then were dependent upon whether or not you were employed for some people. So the surveillance has just leaked into and seeped into all of these different crevices here in society, and namely the way that so many of us make our living.
Well, absolutely. And this was one of the biggest tragedies of this whole situation. I wrote in Why America Matters that everything that happened in lockdown response, well, not everything, but all of these things, whether it was the vaccine mandates, the health passports, lockdowns, travel restrictions, all of these things. I mean, these are not American ideals. These are not Western ideals. The Chinese model of totalitarianism and control. We got it from them. We said, yes, this sounds good. Our bureaucracy implemented it outside of the law, without authority. The problem, of course, beyond that was the human cost. Everyone who lost their job, everyone who couldn't pursue a livelihood to support themselves and their families, everyone who had to make a decision that they didn't want to make because they couldn't or wouldn't risk losing their job and regret it now. I hope that we learn the lesson. I'm concerned that we may not, because I think, again, we still have a large segment of the population who support the idea that government can tell us what to do, can force vaccines on us, can force lockdowns and all these other restrictions, the shuttering of jobs that, of course, hurt small and medium-sized businesses more than gigantic corporations. This was a terrible season. The only good, or one of the good things that came of it, was it woke Americans up. It woke so many people up to what was actually happening in such a way that people decided to take action. Just one last comment on that, which is, historically, one of the things that made Americans special and unique was this extraordinary level of civic involvement. Going back to, we talked about the abolitionist societies or other things. Throughout our history, Americans have gotten very involved, through their churches, through community organizations, through nonprofits, locally, for change. And they were very active in the election process locally. We lost that in this generation. We got lazy. We said to ourselves, oh, some expert is going to take care of that. That's why I, pay my taxes, and that's why I vote once every 4 years, or whatever it is. And we sat on our couches, went behind our screens, complained on Facebook or Twitter, but we lost that direct involvement. And I do think that, as a consequence of everything that's gone on the past few years, that is changing. Americans are waking up. They're getting off their couches. They're getting back out into the streets, into local involvement. And of course, it matters what happens in a national election once every 4 years. But much more important is, what are we doing locally? What are we doing today, this week, in our schools, in our communities? It is going to be a grassroots movement that brings this country back to its core values and its core ideals, when tens of millions of Americans stand up and say no and resist the encroachment of power, the encroachment of these terrible ideologies on them and on their children.
And I think you're speaking there to, so many people that support this organization, We The Patriots USA. They are the ones trying to take action. So we appreciate all of our donors and the people that help us to do what we do. And if you'd like to assist us, you can head over to wethepatriotsusa.org to help support this podcast and everything that We The Patriots is doing. Before we get to the question, which we ask, everybody here on the show, where do we go from here? I do want to hit on briefly, you had a recent article on stormwall.com, your website, about what is the future of money. And I think that ties into this discussion that we're having about surveillance, because, you argue that there's kind of like 3 different types of currencies that could take off from here. One of them being gold, one of them being that, central bank, alternative surveillance currency, basically, is what it should be called, what China's doing, and, cryptocurrency and Bitcoin and things like that. So kind of briefly break those 3 down for us and where you think we're going.
Sure. Maybe the easiest way to conceptualize it is to picture in your mind a triangle. And on the 3 corners of the triangle, the top is the legacy fiat currency system, what we've lived with for the past 70, 80 years or more. In one corner, and another corner put crypto, or not corner, but corner of the triangle, and then finally put this idea of what I call surveillance coins or surveillance currencies. What is crypto? So crypto was developed because of fears around what was happening in traditional money, that governments were out of control, issuing more and more money, more and more debt. So we see in our country, since the financial crisis, the United States, the money supply has tripled. And as has debt. So we now have $31 trillion of national debt. It's about $91,000 per person. And with that was this fear of a return to inflation, which we're now seeing. So the ideas behind crypto were to take money out of the hands of government, to create a hard money alternative that would not inflate, because there was only a finite amount of tokens that could be issued, to make it private, to make it anonymous, and to remove the government or banks or other intermediaries from it, so that it was decentralized. No one could take your value, your Bitcoin, away from you. So that idea of personal autonomy, of liberty, that you were in control of your own money, your own value, really runs against the grain of governments. And so you think about what's happened even recently in recent examples, that when people rose up and sort of resisted a government, they were threatened with having their assets confiscated, their bank accounts confiscated. And the further and further we go into new technologies, even today, most transactions are digital. The government can see them, banks can see them. So we're really losing this essential element of privacy and autonomy that people had in previous generations with cash. You mentioned gold as an alternative. Even in the United States in the 1930s, under FDR, the government confiscated American citizens' gold because they didn't want them to. They wanted to store up in the treasury the gold. They didn't want the citizens to be trading it. People forget that history, that essentially citizens had their assets taken. Now, they were paid for their gold. It wasn't just robbed. But the idea that the government could come and take it away is nothing new. So I argue that government is seeing the innovations in crypto, and it scares them, because they realize that these very ideas of autonomy, decentralization, taking it out of the hands of government, taking it out of the hands of the big banks, they fear this because they get power and they get control by controlling their money, and especially in the instance of the US dollar, controlling the currency, the reserve currency around the world. And so in that third corner is the rise of, for example, central bank digital coins, which are crypto-like in that they run on this digital ledger, digital blockchain. And yet they're issued by the government, they're controlled by the government. And the danger that I foresee there, and we're seeing it in China already, is when the government issues the coins and can see all of the transactions, it's a very short step beyond surveillance to control, to social control. So in China today, you're already seeing a form of social credit scoring, that if you're doing well by the regime, by the government, you get extra benefits, extra points. If you are not, if you're not on board with all of their programs and plans, you get dinged, you get penalized, you don't get access to certain things. It's a very short step from where we are today to that happening here in this nation. There are so many legitimate reasons why one would want to keep one's transactions private. Medical records, charitable contributions, political contributions, lifestyle choices that you make that are not illegal, but that you don't want the entire world to be looking at. I mean, it's just, it's amazing to me that people say, well, I don't do anything wrong. There's no reason that I would care if government sees it. Just wait until that becomes instrument of power to coerce and control your decisions, who you vote for, what you support, what you say publicly. This is extremely dangerous territory. It's aligned with what we've talked about in surveillance, but imagine it in the monetary realm. And I think this is something that we have to continue to resist and look to our representatives to implement good regulation. We need some regulation in crypto, and the crypto industry is asking for guidelines of, where are the rails that we can run down. And that's fine, but it needs to be in a way that is aware of and resists these very points around government control and surveillance.
I think that money is kind of a fine line for so many people. There's been so many different ways that they have been, their rights have been infringed on. But then once you start to talk about their money and their livelihoods and their savings and their family legacy, I think that that's when the line really starts to be drawn in the sand for people. How do people protect themselves moving forward with, what's to come here as far as, money goes, their personal money, and then obviously, the inflation and the debt that we're seeing here to the American dollar?
Yeah, I think, and I don't have a lot of time to go into this, but I'll just touch on it briefly, is just to realize, that I believe strongly that we are not finished with inflation. We've had some easing of some of the numbers. We are far from over. Just to make the point, in December, people sort of clapped their hands and said, oh, yay, when inflation went down to 6.5%. But we've had that now for 2 years. So compounded, Americans have lost only 15% of their purchasing power. Underneath that 6.5% number was electricity inflation that was up 14%, 16% of the big cities. If you're in the Northeast, it was like 22%. And by the way, electricity power companies around the country are proposing to raise their prices by another 10 to 20% next year. I just saw PG&E in California, 18%, in Florida, 10 to 20%, Georgia, same thing. all over the nation. So those price increases that happened last year, it's not the end of it. We're going to see it. How do you protect yourself? Be aware of it, that it's out there. Think about decisions and realize that your cash is not as valuable as it once was. If you have the ability to save up or store up for the future, do so in hard assets, in things like gold and silver. This is not investment advice, but anything that's tangible is likely to perform better than something that is going to continue to lose its value, meaning the US dollar in the years to come.
And I always tell people, be as self-sufficient as you can, plant a garden, do those types of things. And so as we wrap up here, short, just real briefly, where do we go from here?
Yeah, well, first of all, before we lose sight of it, where do we go from here, and where do your viewers and listeners go to find my book? You can find it at
Yes, absolutely.
whyamericaMatters.com. WhyamericaMatters.com is so simple, easy to remember. If you want to hear more or read more about the stuff I'm talking about, I have another website called stormwall.com. Stormwall.com is where I keep all of my articles, videos, podcasts, etc. So you can learn about all sorts of topics, whether it be about the economy, about geopolitics, about some of these issues, other issues facing America. Now, that's the little promo, but the fundamental question you're asking is, where do we go from here? We're in this very interesting turning point type moment where I think it all depends on what we do in the next few years. As bad as it has been, as I mentioned before, I am encouraged by the fact that Americans are waking up. We're in this phase of discovery where we're seeing more and more the depths of what was going on. We talked about the Twitter files, but there are other examples where things are coming to light. And I absolutely believe that sunlight is the best disinfectant, that you need to have these things come out in the open. And we're seeing almost this accumulation, almost like this snowball effect of these revelations. That's important. That's the first step. The second step is accountability. We need our elected representatives to hold the agencies accountable. We're seeing that now with the change in the power in the House, that we are starting to see some formation of committees to look into the weaponization of government agencies, to look into what happened with pandemic response, vaccine mandates, all that sort of thing. So that's essential to it. But ultimately, there will need to be accountability. We cannot just pretend that none of this happened. So I think it's, we mentioned before, also just the grassroots involvement of people in whatever walk of life you may be in. There's always something that you can do. And I always, just like to remind people, take courage. You're not alone. There are people who are struggling with you in the fight. So whatever you do, don't give up. Keep going. Keep up the good fight.
Absolutely. Well, Michael, thank you. We're going to link your website and your two books, Why America Matters and Stormwall, below in the comments. And, just a reminder that we are taking action, and we are here at We The Patriots USA bringing cases, forth to help represent we the people and to preserve those rights. So people can head over to wethepatriotsusa.org to support those efforts. And Michael, we just thank you yourself for stepping out of your comfort zone and being a voice for people.
Thank you very much. Great to be with you today.